Hello everyone, and welcome to part 6 of how to make a platformer game in Unity. So last time we polished our player's movement by adding a bit of acceleration for when you're either landed or in the air. And now I'd like to spend time making it so the camera moves around and focuses on the correct things. Let's start by going to our camera and creating a new script called camera panning. And let's start coding. And here we are. So first, I'd like to think about what we want our camera to do. So we want to move in relation to player. Specifically, move in front, which means when the player is moving like to the right, the camera will lead ahead a few units, and if the player suddenly turns around, the camera will quickly switch to the other side. And we do not want to warp it by modifying transform.position. We want to steadily move it from one place to another. We also want to make it so the camera moves at a constant pace. And what we're going to need is a rigid body 2D, but we should set it to is kinematic. That way it will not move around, it'll remain stiff, and we can only move it by modifying the velocity components directly. Yeah, it cannot act with physics. So now, how do we detect whether or not you're moving? So the simplest way to do this is just to check if the player is pressing the keyboard. And it will accelerate the camera and lock it to the same speed as the player once it reached a certain distance away from the player. So what we're going to need is a floating point value named maximum distance. And this is going to be calculated from the distance between the camera and the player. So this is going to equal the transform.position.x value minus the player's transform.position. But before we can finish this line of code, we need to make it so Unity knows where the player is. The way we're going to do that is by storing the player in a variable. We're going to say var player equals GameObject with a capital G dot find and then just the name, which we called hero. And this is going to be minus this bit of code. So now we know our maximum distance. Actually, this should just be distance. And then another float for max dist, which will just be a constant. And for testing purposes, let's just say 5. In fact, let's see how far 5 would be. So if this is at 2, this is at -3, I'd say that's a little far. Let's make it 2. So now, what I need to do, this max distance value is going to be a threshold for as far in front or behind the camera can be in relation to the player. So if the distance is greater than or equal to the maximum distance, I want to lock your velocity at the player's velocity, which is 6. But there's a small problem. Since the player can be at different speeds when in mid-air, well, there's only one thing I'm worried about, and that's because of your acceleration in mid-air. So during debugging, we're definitely going to have to make sure the camera doesn't mess up when your acceleration changes. Anyway, so once you reach the maximum distance, we're going to set our player dot get component. Actually, we're going to make this dot get component the rigid body 2D dot velocity equal the player. Actually, velocity equaling new vector 2. And for the x velocity, we just want it to be player dot transform dot get component rigid body 2D dot velocity dot x, and for testing purposes, the last bit can be 0 for the y component. And what this line is doing is moving the camera game object at a velocity of however fast the player is moving in the x direction and 0 in the y direction. So if I were to click play and just start moving my player, you can see it starts panning, but it completely forgets about where the player is. So it does half of what it needs to. So I just created this bit to just test. Now the next thing we need to do is make it so it fits less than or equal to negative maximum distance. Actually, we don't need a second if statement, because we could just say or, and that's what these two bars mean, and it's way you get to that is shift backslash, and this will look for this condition to be true or this condition. It will do this. And if you have not reached the max distance, I just want to set it to 0 in both the x and the y directions. And once again, this is just testing purposes. We'll make it so it accelerates with respect to the player later. So now it works a bit better, but it still suffers from the same problem of not being able to really see whether or not the player is moving. And this is where the camera speeding up past the player and then stopping comes in. So in the next episode, we'll work out the bugs and make the camera accelerate past the player and fix this oddity where if you die while holding a certain direction, that the camera will keep panning. We'll also get to work on how the player or the camera pans in the y direction where if the player falls and keeps accelerating. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you have any questions about this video or suggestions for how to improve future videos, please let me know. And I hope you check out my next video. Goodbye.